The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. The words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Kia ora and welcome to one of 200, the politics podcast where Carl usually says the rest of it, so I don't actually remember and I don't usually listen to him. We've got just a two-hander today, actually. This is a specialist episode. We're not doing current affairs, but we are doing current affairs. It's a little bit different. I'm here, your co-host, who's also just a host, Simone. And with us is Jen Shields from, is it Jen Shield or Shields? From
Shields,
Puberty.
plural.
Jen Shields, 'cause there's more than one. How are we doing this fine morning?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me back.
It's quite all right. We're here today because we're following up pretty quickly on an episode that we recorded not too long ago, where we were talking about, well, in not to mince words, a puberty blocker ban that was just for trans children and not for cis children, that the Ministry of Health wanted to implement and was going to come into effect. And of course, you can correct me, this is my understanding, on the 19th of December, approximately 28 days after the decision was made, which is standard. So in the interim, Parthay had made an injunction in the High Court for judicial review, and that was an interim decision, and we've now got it back. That came back, I want to say, actually, when was this published? Do you remember?
17th.
Of December. Okay, it was a pretty quick turnaround, which is quite positive. So the decision is from Justice Wilkinson Smith, whom I've appeared before. Her Honor, I quite like Her Honor. Good judge, smart, and in this case, to explain a little bit before I let you talk about the substantive sort of proceeding, judicial review is where somebody comes and says the executive, the sort of part of the government that makes decisions we might think of, like, cabinet is part of that, has made a decision. In this case, it was the Ministry of Health, but the directive was from cabinet, and this is reviewable, right? This is justiciable. There are some that aren't, but in this case, this was partly on procedural grounds, was what the attempted review was. But there is a substantive review. So this interim injunction is just in the meantime, essentially. And what the judge had to decide before we get to the substantive review is, in essence, weighing up this kind of sudden change and allowing these regulations to go through that would ban puberty blockers for children experiencing a gender dysphoria, gender incongruence, against the supposed or raised by the respondent dangers of allowing several months to pass until the substantive review while the regulations are stopped if the application for an interim injunction was successful. And that's sort of what had to be weighed up. Is that roughly about what went on?
Yeah. For this interim order, that's exactly right. The decision really came down to what the risk for harm is for allowing a few more months of trans kids being able to access this care versus the harm of a ban being introduced immediately. And Her Honor was so clear on that in the judgment, which is publicly available. She basically straight up says, a few more months obviously isn't going to do anything in terms of bone density for a young person, which is the number one risk the Crown keeps going on about.
I noticed.
And very explicitly says the evidence relating to mental health outcomes suggests negative outcomes from a ban are a far more immediate concern.
Yeah, it's quite a positive judgment in that respect. So the issue that the court was looking at specifically was it was quite simple. Was should these regulations, which were going to take effect before a substantive judicial review could be heard, did they need to be halted? And not come in, the status quo remain. But there is also that substantive question. There's a kind of public interest test that'll need to be decided as to whether prescribing puberty blockers should just be taken out of GPs' hands, out of the clinical setting, and be something that is not between GPs, children, families, and God, but actually, everyone else has to have a look-see, and this is something that can no longer be done. So it's, on the face of it, and we talked about this, and I'm glad that the High Court's picked up on this. It's facially a discriminatory regulation. And this is something that was quite important, I think, when we get to sort of the evidence section and what was discussed in respect of that, because there's almost nothing that could be said about prescription for children who happen to be trans against children who happen to be cis for all of these. But the regulations were quite clear that this is not about precocious puberty, quote unquote. This is about children who are experiencing gender dysphoria. So it's a
Mm.
targeted and discriminatory kind of regulation, right? And there are a lot of things that are bound up in that. They will come up, I suspect, in the substantive review. I'll just quickly go through essentially the five heads of the judge's reasoning, and then we'll talk about some of how this came about. So, the first reason why this was successful and why Path A was successful and knocked this out of the park in the interim injunction was that a total ban. Her Honor had decided, had rules that a total ban would be more extreme than the UK and Scandinavia, even as outliers on puberty blockers have done. Because, for example, in the United Kingdom, the Cass report has meant that now there is a trial on puberty blockers, and so there is actually still access through the NHS. It's just barbarous, right? That's at paragraphs 177 to 179. There's a discussion of how, for example, the concerns about fertility being affected and so on don't hold any evidential weight, which is quite positive as a ruling. The second is that there's no evidence that there's any urgency needed in this, and you talked about that a little bit. The third is that puberty blockers are understood to be reversible, and we have decades of research on this now, which is helpful. They've been used for 4 decades for precocious puberty, and 15 years, I believe, was the Dr. A's evidence for how long they've been used for this specific purpose for trans kids. Four is that the only health impact that we could look at is bone density, and so you've touched on that a little bit. That's not an issue for a few months until the substantive judicial review, when we weigh everything on balance, right? It's simply not nearly as much of an issue, and it can be mitigated by, for example, giving kids vitamins. The fifth is that the evidence falls towards poor mental health outcomes for removing this if the regulations go through, and that's an immediate concern against the kind of bone density that issue that the Crown kept raising in this proceeding, which is not an immediate concern. So you have one which is clearly in favor of an interim injunction. When I read this judgment, what popped out to me is that reasons 1 and 3 were the kind of positive signs for a substantive win in coming months. Because those are already findings which have been made and can be pointed to on the face of it. So, the total ban being more extreme than the UK and Scandinavia. That's something which isn't just relevant for an interim injunction. That's quite helpful for you for a substantive proceeding. And puberty blockers being reversible is also an evidential finding by the judge, right? Based on the evidence that was proffered to the court. And that's also quite positive for the substantive review. But much of it was about the kind of time-sensitive nature of it. And this has been turned around really quickly. So I wanted to talk to you about how this came about from your perspective, from Path A's perspective, because when I read through, although there wasn't, my understanding is there's no in-person hearing anything, everything was just filed affidavit evidence. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was a hearing, but based in Pornicky, where most of
Mhm.
us are not. So some of us attended virtually. Yeah.
A submissions only hearing from counsel, I imagine.
Mm. Yeah.
Right. So there has been evidence before the court, but by and large, this is something that had to be turned around very quickly. And it seems that you probably didn't have, I imagine, the actual evidence just kind of really locked and loaded to go. But certainly everybody just kind of geared up and the machine moved very quickly, which is quite impressive. And I have to commend you for that. So tell us about how this came about once you heard that these regulations were going to come to pass in 28 days.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we had been preparing for something similar to this for like a number of years now, right? Like even as early as when the initial evidence brief that the Ministry of Health commissioned was announced way back, I think, in like 2021, 2022, potentially earlier, we had concerns about how that would be politicized and played out. And over the last couple of years have been really thinking about like what the possibilities might be and what the response might look like. And really, yeah, really lucky to work with a really good team of lawyers. So as soon as the decision was announced, we reached out and set up a meeting, and it became very clear that a judicial review was going to be or at least was going to be a important aspect of the response. So got to work right away. Because we've also been navigating this issue with the non-publication of the 2025 guidelines for gender affirming healthcare, which links so closely to this stuff. We'd already been doing some prep work in terms of strategy and comms and thinking about what the legal response might be to that as well. So it just meant we were in the perfect position to be able to respond really quickly when it was needed, which was really helpful. Uh, yeah, yeah. So everything happened really quickly.
Fantastic. That's quite good. And I suppose you'll have what the court says the substantive hearing in months, which is quite a fast turnaround, I have to say. So I'm sure you'll be still gearing up for that. And of course, there's this, a limit to what we can talk about in respect of that because you have to have your kind of legal proceeding, which means, shut the fuck up about what your arguments are, right? So we're not going to touch that or go anywhere near that. But this decision is quite helpful. And it is positive in respect of you getting the outcome that you wanted, that Parthay getting the outcome that it wanted. And of course, these families and kids, probably much more importantly, being able to. The numbers are much lower than I expected. There is, of course, if we think very briefly about the media blow-ups in the UK, in New Zealand, there is a huge kind of moral panic about this, to borrow a term from the transphobes, irreversible damage, right? And I think crucially, reversibility is a term which is kind of explored in the judgment. But the numbers are really low, which was almost concerning to me from the other end that statistically there are going to be a lot more trans children, but evidently the medical options aren't necessarily that well known for people, or there is home pressure, or there are a whole lot of reasons. But nevertheless, despite how much moral panic there is about the use of puberty blockers for children, the numbers are really low. It was something like 650 in total were using them between the ages of 12 and 17. And 2023, 2024, it was somewhere around there, open to correction on that. But quite low numbers nationally.
Yeah, we're talking about like 100 kids per year who are managing to access this care in the first place. And even in the UK, where the population and, the total population is obviously so much larger,
Hmm.
the systems over there are so abysmal that the real numbers we're talking about there were in the hundreds as well. Like internationally, this attack on the well-being of our young people is, yeah, so fake, so fake, babes. We're
Yeah.
talking about a couple of hundred kids.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Uh, and we'll pick the brains out, I think, a little bit out of the comparison because the first ground, the discussion of, this total ban that happened very suddenly, what Her Honor Justice Wilkinson Smith described as taking the transgender community by surprise, which is true. This was a bit of an ambush, although we knew that there had been a consultation that was kept under wraps. The RIS was kept under wraps. This total ban is more extreme than the UK and in Scandinavia. Not sure why they just compared with those countries, but I would have to reread perhaps the specific passages to see if there's any reason why we're looking at that. I have real concerns about that ground, even though you were successful, which I want to discuss later, and also the discussion of some of the reasoning approaches that to me seem to open the door to rolling back some of these through kind of side means, particular, the presentation of this as like say being an off-label use. So I wanted to discuss some of those in a little bit, but we've touched on the res already. And I think that's a really good early kind of point for us to get in because, and crucially, the applicant, Path A, our good friend and guest right here, had noted that this public advice wasn't available. So you were somewhat flying blind. And when the Riz came out and we read it, and you can read it, and I encourage everybody to read it, you can see why the fuck why, right? Like this is not good for cabinet. Um, just to summarize briefly my understanding, and then I'll let you discuss what happened when that came out, and you could all look at it and look and read it. The Riz notes that the use of puberty blockers is scant. It's not that many people. It notes that the submissions were almost all in support of the continued use of puberty blockers for the purpose that they're used for. Um, so we didn't have this huge flood of transphobes overwhelming us. Actually, we were pretty successful, I think, at talking to the ministry about how how this actually affected real human beings and real kids and what it would have meant for their lives. The Riz gave four options, and just to be very brief about it, Riz said option one was it's a the advice of the minister, which was essentially status quo. This is a clinical decision between a doctor and a child. If they have Gillett competence, if not, the family is involved with consent, right? Cabinet didn't listen to that advice. The minister didn't listen to that advice, and chose option four, which was nuke puberty blockers, total ban, just suddenly.
Interestingly, option four is so option three was regulatory action and had a couple of different
Mm,
facets to it. One was what they've done essentially, using the Medicines Act to make a regulation, but they also considered an act of parliament. Option four is almost like this artificial softening of option three by
mm,
including a ban plus what they call quote unquote increased access to alternative gender services, which is repeated throughout the regulatory impact statement in like quite concerning ways, because to be very, very clear, a
mm.
gender service, quote unquote, with no access to gender affirming medical treatment is a conversion service.
Yes.
But then in the end, they don't even like it's so obvious that option four is presented to make the impact assessment look more favorable for the Crown, and the ministry threw all these ideas around like what alternative gender services could look like and the resourcing that should go into that and what that might look like in practice. And in the end, when it came down to it, Cabinet saw that and went, what's the cheapest possible option we can go with? So their alternative gender service is a website that contains a list of gender services around the country, and this is what they think will mitigate the harm of a generation of young people's access to healthcare being taken away.
It's Web 2.0, baby. That's going to solve all our problems. You're absolutely right. And what is really curious is that, unless I'm misreading it, the ministry, in proffering its advice to the minister, warned against option four and said, "This is the bad one. Let's not pick this."
Yeah, the ministry said they were all bad. Like they are very, very clear that the status quo is the best possible option, that all of the other options considered raise the risk profile for children and young people. It's really quite a weird experience to read that regulatory impact statement because it feels like you've got two really significant things butting up against each other. Like one is the ministry's less informed than I would like, but still grounded in the truth position, which is that these bans are harmful, that puberty blockers do have positive benefits for trans young
Yeah.
people. And then you have the Crown's obviously mandated position, which is like, no, this is the devil, these are the worst ever. So you have within the same document the ministry being very clear that removing puberty blockers is going to have a tangible negative impact on people's well-being, while also saying, like a few paragraphs later, that puberty blockers have no impact on people's well-being because that's the line they have to argue. Like
Yeah.
it's nonsensical.
Yeah, there's a real difficulty I think that arises when somebody reads the Riz, exactly as you've said, because you have on the one hand the evidence of how this actually works and what would be sane in practice and has been used for so long, and then on the other hand, just to quote, they say the policy problem. is concerned that puberty blockers should only be prescribed for young people with gender incongruent dysphoria for whom the benefits of these medicines outweigh the potential risks. That's not a policy problem. I mean, that's not a description of a problem. You're just saying this is what the ministers told us. Is something to look at. And I know that they have to draft it within a certain rubric, but there's a point at which policy is so kind of nonsensical and or discriminatory that describing it in the usual standard rubric formula of a RIS shows how silly it is, right? And this was the case here. I think Parfait, the applicant of this case and the injunction, had raised in its statement of claim, according to the judge, I haven't read the statement of claim, um, a lack of discovery, right? There are real discovery issues around this. Like you had proffered your evidence, but you said, look, we've got jack nothing from the minister for health in this case, from the ministry generally, just from the Crown overall, including a lack of what the actual advice was. How do we know? How can we even make these arguments? And then quite suddenly, is my understanding, before the judgment, the Riz came out. Do you remember what happened with that?
Yeah, so Petha finally got the Crown's evidence late on the Saturday immediately before our Tuesday morning hearing.
Mhm.
So quite late in the piece and quite an odd time of day. And we had kind of expected for a bit of a document dump right on the Crown's evidence deadline.
Yeah.
But we were put in this really quite surreal and challenging position where we had these documents because of the court case. They weren't public, even though the decision or the regulation itself was due to come into effect, within the following week, uh, or 2 weeks. That wasn't available to the general public. We weren't able to share them. The ministry had been telling people that they would be proactively released and had given a number of different dates out to people. In the end, they were released to the public again relatively late in the day on that 18th of December,
Mm.
well less than 12 hours before the regulation came into effect. Like, yeah, transparency isn't even a word that I would use in relation to any of this. Like, it's been so obfuscated the whole way along
Yeah.
because of exactly what we expected. The ministry's documents make it really, really clear that a ban was the worst option available to them, and the minister and cabinet chose like a political campaign over the well-being of children in New Zealand.
Yeah, a rare misstep from Simeon Brown. I think it is. Perhaps. I mean, this happens, but it's a little shocking that the Crown has acted in this manner. And I think my perception, reading between the lines, is that the High Court has picked up on them. The High Court's very annoyed, as well. As for whether that lasts for the substantive hearing, we don't know, but it seems that dragging the chain is kind of the order of the day. That's a real concern, I think, for any kind of public policy position, but one in particular, which is going to have such acute effects, with a total ban on a necessary medicine for children who fall into a particularly vulnerable group, and who have particular human rights issues that attach to them, right? That was my understanding was that was filed in the evidence. So there were four affidavits. Well, one of them is you gave evidence. One of them is was it Mr. Brez? I'm not sure who that is, and two clinicians or health professionals. We don't know. They're anonymized, Dr. A and Dr. B. And uh, one of the pieces of evidence put forward by Parfait was that this was a shocking decision. It's very sudden, and that it will cause quite significant deleterious effects for these families and for these kids in particular. That's not something, from what I could see, that the Crown particularly grappled with in its evidence. It seemed to almost be not talking past each other, but the Crown didn't seem to want to engage with what I perceived to be the strongest parts of Pathé's case. A little bit concerning that the ministry seemed to not really have much of an answer to those concerns. Really, and I'm quite glad that the court has fallen in favor of it and has outlined that real concern. The Crown had filed evidence from the minister, which essentially said they wanted to do this. that puberty blockers used in this manner are an off-label use, and that's okay. But there are unknown consequences. This is an unknown quantity. This is really complicated and complex. And actually, they just kind of wanted to ban them, and so therefore they did. That's roughly my reading of what the case from the Crown was. I could be being unfair about that, but one thing that I was drawn to was how much the Crown had, at least the perception from the judgment is, harped on about the Cass review. This is probably why I think it's important for us to continue to talk about what's going on in the UK, because there seems to be a model for how do we attack transgender people everywhere, including through the medical system. And that was seen as an example. Now, what's kind of unusual is that the judge said this obviously goes beyond what has happened in the UK, but the Cass report is not useful for its medical contents. It's useful for its rhetorical use, right? As a kind of tool to beat trans people with. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about seeing that that was something being used by the Crown and what, not to go over a lot of material that we've talked about before, but what not in itself, but what does the Cass report really mean for New Zealand now that we know that this is something that political parties, that the Crown is looking at and saying, how can we use this to remove healthcare from trans people?
Mm. I think the case report is most beneficial for the Crown here in that it kind of gives them an excuse. Like the UK is doing this, so we might as well, right? We've
Yeah.
yeah, have this like such a strong undercurrent in our like social and political context here in Aotearoa where like far too many Pākehā still look at the UK as like the motherland as like the the example to follow, which
Yeah.
like is a worse and worse choice by the day. Look at everything that's happening over there. But like we saw it throughout this whole process, right? The ministry's evidence brief and position statement was delayed expressly so that they could take into account the findings of the Cass review,
Yeah.
notably, similar or comparable reviews or updated guidelines or developments and evidence that happened in that period that they were taking into consideration the Cass review, they ignored completely. And even in the ban itself being tied to the conclusion of the UK's clinical trials, which haven't started yet, aren't due to finish until 2031, expressly conversion practice trials, like
Yes.
the inclusion criteria for those trials over there, that you have your clinician has to be satisfied that you have engaged sufficiently with holistic alternatives. And there's a new paper from Cal Horton, who's an incredible researcher in the UK, just out today, that makes it really, really clear that those holistic alternatives are conversion practices. Like I've spoken to them about the fact that the pathways in the UK now mandate a 2-day psychoeducation program for both parent and young person, where the parent and young person are separated and are in different classes for 48 hours. People have to travel for this. The young people, it's not quite clear what they're being taught. The parents are expressly being taught how to do conversion practices on their kids. Like, this is the kind of quality of care that this government is looking to replicate and is tying everything back to. But because it's the UK, because it's the motherland, because it's this, yeah, we just have this unbelievable framing as this example to follow. It basically gives them this cover. But I think we need to be really clear about the fact that what the UK is doing would be illegal in Aotearoa because we have an actual conversion practice ban that prevents people from trying to convert trans kids.
Yeah. And to clarify for people who don't know, conversion therapy is pray the gay away camps, but secular, in other words. It doesn't work. This is just psychologically torturing young children, really. When I look at what, according to the court, the evidence was in respect of that, I think this is something that might be revisited in the substantive review. I don't know. But for the time being, it sort of has to be accepted on its face that this is what has been put forward. Um, the evidence can be weighed, but not particularly challenged or tested because you don't have that substantive hearing yet. And so the court looks at it on the face of it and says, okay, well, the respondent says that the case review has found, and I'm reading from paragraph 103 of the judgment, the rationale for early puberty suppression remains unclear, with weak evidence regarding the impact on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health. The case review stated that the adoption of a treatment with uncertain benefits without further scrutiny was a significant departure from established practice. This is what's like a polite way of saying horse shit. Um,
Nonsense.
this is not true.
Yeah.
Um, the Cass report essentially manufactured the outcome where it could say this by rejecting all of the medical evidence. And it rejected medical evidence on the basis that uh, almost every trial wasn't double blind, which we can say is, yes, a scientific gold standard, but in this case would be unimaginably cruel to inflict. Because if you're giving one group of children who have gender dysphoria medication and another group placebos, they're going to both know immediately and be really distressed by the fact that they are still having the body horror of the wrong puberty changes happening to their bodies. So this is something which is not done. And the Castro picked on that and said, okay, we can throw out the years and years of evidence that we have on puberty blockers. But there's also a really simple logical reason from my perspective why this doesn't make sense, which is that puberty blockers work for precocious children and cisgender children in exactly the same way as they do for trans children. So I wanted to pick apart what I think the court has accepted, which might be an issue in the future. And it's this description of the use of puberty blockers for trans kids as being off-label because then you have different regulations and different sort of in the primary legislation there are different sections which will govern here, and the government can kind of regulate them in a different manner. And obviously, you know, what was done here was, on the face of it, for the time being, unlawful until the substantive review came through. But this is probably accepted clinically. But from my perspective as somebody, I can't perceive, for example, the difference between where a trans kid uses it and a cisgender kid uses it because they have the same medical effect and they are for the same medical purposes. To me, when I read off-label, what I think of is aspirin being used for somebody's heart issues, really mild heart issues, because that's not the purpose for which it was designed. Puberty blockers are designed to block puberty. That's what they do in cisgender children. That's what they do in transgender children. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the kind of clinical and medical framing of puberty blockers, in this case and generally in New Zealand, in terms of its practice.
Yeah, so I'm not a clinician, but I think from my understanding, like I think one of the issues and kind of what you're getting at is that we have framed puberty blockers as a treatment for gender dysphoria or as a treatment for gender incongruence, and thus the off-label prescribing, right? But
Mm-hmm.
you're so right. Like the purpose for both of its use in precocious puberty and for trans kids is pubertal suppression.
Mm.
And that's what they do really well. That's their intended purpose. They're really effective at that. So I think there's a bit of framing and that framing issues that follow through to how the Crown in particular consider the evidence as well. And this is a common thread that we saw in the Cass review, that we see in lots of bad faith reviews of gender affirming healthcare, is this idea that puberty blockers aren't effective at like improving people's mental health. Because obviously, put yourselves in the shoes of a trans young person, like all puberty blockers are doing are pausing any further changes to your body. They aren't improving things. They aren't intended to improve things. They're intended to stabilize things. And certainly we see stability in people's mental health, and we do see improvements in terms of people's ability to engage in public life. But because we have framed puberty blockers as a treatment for gender dysphoria, gender incongruence, rather than as a puberty suppression tool, that flows on to how we consider the evidence as well. And I think it's really interesting, just as you were talking, it came to mind, and it is referenced in the judgment, so I can mention it. The only time we have ever seen anyone from the Crown or the Ministry point out the fact that limitations in quality of evidence aren't limited just to puberty blockers. They're common across lots of other areas of health, and the same for prescribing off-label. common across lots of other areas of health. But the only time we've seen someone from the ministry or the Crown acknowledge the fact that limitations in these quality of evidence are common is in the Crown's evidence in this hearing. One of their witnesses, Dr. Hill, makes the point that the absence of this evidence is not unusual, and that clinicians prescribe in the absence of randomized control trials all the time. But I think it's really interesting that the first time we saw that is in like a court context where they have been, engaged in a judicial review because of the poor process and decision making that led to this point, but not once in the regulatory impact statement in any of the ministry's documents anywhere else is it mentioned that this is totally normal and totally common. So I think the other big issue we have with how we view this medication in particular is it's like so tied to the culture war context, to it's just the identity aspect of it as well, to the fact that trans kids use this. And we saw it in the regulation itself when it was initially published and written. It was so unbelievably broad that it would not only limit a trans young person from accessing puberty blockers, for example, for endometriosis, it would also limit a trans adult from accessing this healthcare at all because the lack of understanding in this. So they actually had to issue a quick and fast update to the regulation to specify that it didn't apply to adults. But there are still issues with how it's phrased because of the choice, the weird choice that they made to frame the regulation as banning new prescriptions for people with gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. It's nonsense.
In respect of what Parfait had filed, it seems that most of the substantive clinical information was from Dr. A. Dr. B largely was discussing and annexing, it seems to me, the kind of medical professional bodies' opinions on this matter. And they are, by and large, just there's this wealth of medical professional bodies which say we have no idea what the government is doing. This is going to be hugely damaging. So this, whether or not the Crown wants to quibble on the science by taking the same cast report approach and saying, well, look, if we throw out almost everything, it's kind of unclear as to whether it's negative or positive, but ignore the fact that it's supposed to be neutral. That's the point of this medicine. Like sort of ignoring that and setting that aside. The medical professional opinion on this is unequivocal. Anybody who deals with this, it seems, and deals with transgender children who have the competence to be able to make this decision, or with families and parents who, come into that decision as well, to start puberty blockers and see what happens. Everybody knows how positive this is. In fact, it seems to me that there were professional bodies that piped up straight away and had issues about this, including I think was it the Hut DHB and Carpety in Wellington, pretty much came out straight away and said, there's a real concern about this here. I think it was. So
Yeah, that would have been, I think that's referenced in the judgment, so I can reference it. That will be the DHB issuing a update to their formal risk register, making it really explicit that they anticipate a significant increased risk in terms of the complexity and mental health needs of trans young people in the region because of this ban.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And you've also got, so you have these kind of medical professional bodies. You've also got as well, and obviously because mental distress is involved in this, the Association of Psychotherapists as well opposing the regulations, and saying that these are, complex clinical decisions which need to be made in a clinical setting, essentially. I wanted to talk about that a little bit because my perception from the judgment, and this could be just something that I'm reading with it, is the framing of it is, look, this is so extreme, this total ban, that it goes beyond what the UK and Scandinavia have done. I'm interested in whether or not there is a perceived risk for people that the door is being left open for, like you said, the res put forward the fourth option almost as a kind of extreme option to make the other options, like option three, seem less extreme. Whether or not, even if the Crown is unsuccessful with this, it has another crack at it, and is just more subtle about it by saying, look, there's not that much evidence. We've got to do our own cast report. We've got to put children through gender conversion therapy to see whether or not these things are safe. On the other hand, pushing back against that, I will say Dr. A's evidence says, look, we've been doing this for 15 years and we know what it does. And they're reversible and also really essential medicines, sometimes life-saving medicines for children. I'm curious about that kind of framing. And perhaps whether or not I'm just being too negative and too cynical about this, to say that instead we could say, oh, well, Scandinavia does that and they're progressive and advanced, so why don't we try to follow somewhere
Mm.
along that pathway, and it shouldn't just be the status quo forever, because it does seem to me that we are the kind of thin end of the wedge here for an attack on queer people generally and trans people specifically, by using this kind of moral panic about children. That does seem to be the order of the day from the government, is my perception.
Yeah, yeah, you're so right. And we've seen like internationally how, bans on this care for young people are used as that wedge, to further bans for gender affirming care for all ages. Like, yeah, you can see what's happening in the States, and that is a bit of a look into the, potential future for I would say like worst case scenarios. But I think we also have a bit of a like an opportunity, right? Because
Mhm.
similarly, we can also be a wedge. Aotearoa can be a wedge. And certainly we hear from people overseas, in Australia and the UK and parts of America who say, at least before this ban was announced, they look to New Zealand, to Aotearoa as an example of a country that is continuing to hold up against the encroaching culture war and attacks on our rights and well-being. So um, I think it's one of the reasons why it was so clear that we needed to take action so quickly is that, winning this is a win, obviously, for trans people and young people and families here in Aotearoa, but is also a win for trans communities internationally. So I think there's an opportunity to win this really handily. And I think the interim judgment we already have some paragraphs in there that are going to have, significant impacts on international jurisprudence as well, which is really fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. Like in the end, the power imbalance is so stark here that the government can do what they want, and are, but it was important to us that we, if they're going to do this, we're going to make them fight for it. But I also think the timing doesn't work in their favor, right? Like if we go to a hearing kind of early mid next year, presumably we might not get a decision for a while after that. That's well
Mhm.
into election season.
Yeah.
Who knows? Anything could happen between here and now. I think as it stands now, I don't think they want to make this like the core of their election campaign, and we will make a fuss out of it. And like these medical bodies, we didn't reach out to a single one of them. They all immediately responded of their own initiative, putting out these statements. Like I think public and professional opinion is so on the side of trans people in Aotearoa, which can be really hard to see because that's not what it looks like online.
Mm.
But in on the ground, in the scheme of things, I think this is winnable. I think, they could introduce an act of parliament to make the ban stronger, but that's a big move politically. I don't know that they have the appetite for it. And the case we are bringing has a few different rationale or reasons why we think this decision was bad, and they would have to fix a lot of things that, from my perspective, don't seem fixable because at the core of it, the Medicines Act has to be used for evidence-based, genuine reasons to introduce these regulations, and it's so clearly obvious that there isn't a genuine, enough evidence base to use that same mechanism. So again, they might go for something else, but we'll keep fighting it. And I think, yeah, I think if it's not a winning election campaign strategy, right? We've seen that from the States more recently. People continuing to focus on trans people aren't seeing those results in the polls.
Yeah, it's when you look at the judgment specifically, for example, paragraph 138, which I've just pulled up, the sort of the Crown bringing up, we haven't had these randomized controlled trials, that we're expected to hear the sort of evidence from the United Kingdom because the Cass report, like what we were just talking about a little earlier, and therefore it seems their best argument seems to me to be muddying the waters and saying, look, this is a complicated issue. This is a really complex. We don't actually know. There's a whole lot of lacunae in the evidence that we can't say that it's untested. And look, isn't that a scary word for us? Children, untested medicine, children in the same sentence, appearing close to each other in proximity. Aren't you terrified? Like, it seems to me that that is the kind of best argument that can be mustered up, which is not exactly particularly a winning electoral position, as I think you pointed out, that you can create a moral panic about, think of the children. But this is really getting in the weeds because what the Crown's argument is look, it's just complicated, isn't it? And we don't have great evidence.
Yeah,
So when we pull that lens back, which I think you've done very effectively, and I do want to talk about that, that's not a winner. That's not a rhetorical winner, at least for the general New Zealand public. I think most people have a kind of not to be too mean to New Zealanders, but a kind of anti-intellectual bent, wherein if you start talking about like, clinical trials and settings, people just kind of want to switch off. Like
mm,
that's not something which necessarily whips up the fervor of the mob with pitchforks, is talking about this. And the Cass report's been, I think, very unsuccessful at doing so in the UK, is my perception. Even
mm,
though, of course, there is institutional transphobia there, which is something which we don't quite struggle with the same class hierarchy of insane aristocrats who have this as their like have made themselves insane online by like reading turf talking points over and over. So that's a bit of a difference.
mm. I
But
guess
when we sorry, I was
I was
talking
going to
about the
say, I guess the only other thing I'd note on that point is that, like, I think this judicial review is like just the first step, right?
yeah.
Because if you look at the regulatory impact statement, there's one line quite early on that really guts me deeply, where they
Mm,
say very clearly and explicitly that increasing access to this medication isn't within scope, and the only options they're considering is reduced access. And all of the options they offer, even the softened ones, would be like a significant deterioration in the quality of care that young people have access to here in Aotearoa. And in particular, they suggest this kind of formalized, lengthy, laborious multidisciplinary team structure that the UK has, where a multidisciplinary team is a panel of a number of different clinicians that a young person has to go and see and get approval from every individual one of them, often in a room all together, super invasive, really
yeah.
horrifically challenging. And in fact, what we have here is better than that. Like we have access to multidisciplinary teams, but they're not mandated. Like there's no reason why every single young person would need to see a psychiatrist, a psychologist,
Yeah.
like a OT. There's so many other different specialties here. That's centering around like the need of the medical system, the need of the political system, but not the needs of the young person. So I think even beyond just winning this case, there's a fight to continue to be had to make sure that we're actually improving access to care because we know there are inequities. We know people outside of
Yeah.
like Auckland and Wellington can't access this care. We know Māori and Pacifica young people aren't accessing this care. There's so much work to be done to improve access.
Yeah.
And obviously, this is taking attention at the moment, but as soon as this wrapped up, or like before this wraps up, even, I want to be thinking about the next government and really making sure that they aren't going to end up somewhere in the middle and still restricting care in some way or another. When the focus needs to be on improved access and just that right to bodily autonomy and self-determination.
Yeah. Well, you've zoomed the lands out very effectively. You're doing my job for me, actually. It's a one-hander today, folks. So I think that's really critical. And to briefly pull at something that you said, which is not the main point. In the UK, the kind of hoops that people had to jump through and now no longer can jump through because the hoops don't exist and the circus doesn't exist. They've just taken away essentially medical care for trans people, even adults in the UK. It's extremely difficult to access now. That the NHS essentially had hoops that were extraordinarily invasive. You had to have, my understanding was about two different psychological professionals separately sit down and talk to you and ask you questions like, what do you think about when you masturbate? Like, just the most humiliation ritual that one could imagine that a person has to go through just to access really basic, the most basic care about their body.
And they ask these questions to children too. Like
Yeah.
this isn't just the adult service. We're talking about like children and young people being asked super invasive questions about their genitalia, their sexuality,
Mm,
like whether or not they masturbate, how often they do it, what they think about. Like it's
mm,
obsessive. And we see that in the yeah, you're right. It's like within the system and service as a whole, but we also see that in the protocol for the clinical trial they're just about to launch, where the questions, some of them seem like questions you would ask someone to induce dysphoria. Like, how do you feel about your nose? Would you like surgery to change it? How do you feel about your cheekbones? Would you like surgery to change it? How do you feel about your chin? Would you like surgery to change it? Like, it's torture.
yeah, yeah. Never thought about it before, but thanks, I've got a new thing.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just, and it really is, I think, that kind of, if we look at, oh, well, the motherland, like you've said, quite effectively, I think, this is the model, and the government said, look, we can point to this. I mean, this really, I think, is why the UK exists. This is perhaps in the Anglosphere, certainly the United Kingdom seems to me the most effectively organized, institutionally transphobic apparatus that exists. And so, therefore, it will continue to churn out these things that can be used by people. But conversely, I think for us, we can also look at it and say, look, we're actually seeing an increase in, all of these issues with self-harm, with, people ending their lives shortly. And that has already started in the UK. It has got worse. And when we zoom out the lens, which we were just talking about, the fight continues, as you said. So when we talk about this for people, what for you do you think people should be cognizant of? I want to talk a little bit about involvement, but I know that this is difficult because that's from a kind of political perspective. Parthe is a kind of professional association that's clinical in nature. So it's not like, you're not a doctor, you can't join. If you are a doctor, I mean, please like get involved, get connected up with the resources and that. If you're not a doctor, what should people be thinking about toward the future? Because we are coming into, this election year, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll mention briefly that PETHA isn't just for doctors. We've got yeah, social workers, mental health professionals, but also researchers, advocates, peer support workers. If you're working in some way or another to improve the health and well-being of trans and non-binary people in Aotearoa, you're eligible to be a member.
Mhm.
So please consider it. But yeah, more broadly than just that, I think obviously coming into election season, I really want to see like an increased focus on just the absolute bottom line of like self-determination and bodily autonomy for trans people and for everyone, right? Because one of the things we haven't touched on, but I think is worth mentioning, is the fact that as this is horrible in and of itself because of the way it is discriminating and abusing trans young people, but it is also horrible because of the precedent it sets for a government minister to unilaterally decide what healthcare is, you are allowed to access or not. So not just trans people, people who need access to reproductive healthcare,
Mhm.
people who need access to mental health healthcare, all of these things are no longer a guarantee in this country if we allow a politician to interfere so directly with healthcare. So I think having that really solid foundation in terms of like what trans people are asking for and what everyone in this country deserves is the right to self-determination and the right to bodily autonomy. And I think we often kind of get caught up in the weeds, like you say, of like the medical evidence and clinical trials and quality of academic evidence. And if we're able to really bring it back to the fact that what we're talking about here is the right for someone to decide what happens to their body. Yeah, everyone benefits from that, right? So I think that's one of the big things as we head into the election season, just really putting the pressure on the main centrist parties and, absolutely Labour. But I think also there are some national MPs who won't be happy with how this is playing out either. So I don't think it's a lost cause to be hammering them on this too. but especially for Labour, really focusing on the fact that we need improved access, not any restriction in any way whatsoever. But also really looking beyond the political sphere, like especially if you're a trans person in Aotearoa, I'm really interested in the ways that we can support each other more directly without reliance on these systems that are always going to have the ability and possibility of taking away our rights. So I think building up those community networks much more strongly is going to be really critical.
So people can kind of get involved at the community level.
Mm.
You have touched on something which I think we'd omitted briefly, which is the discussion about guilt competence in the judgment. If you are having a teen pregnancy, being able to procure an abortion, this is something which affects that right? You know, and the ability for young people, like adolescents, to have medical decisions where they are in an unsafe home environment to make those when they're competent, without parents having to be roped in when it's dangerous for them, right? Which
And
to
with
me explains probably in part, as well as the lack of knowledge of puberty blockers, why the numbers are so low for people accessing this. It's not always a safe home environment for kids, and this sort of takes autonomy out of their hands. You said that very effectively, I think, was this is an issue of human autonomy and treating children like they are actual serious moral subjects.
Yeah, we've already seen like New Zealand anti-trans groups starting to advocate for the removal of Gillet competency as a concept, which, like you say, is the thing that allows, people under 16 who need contraception to access that when they need it, or other forms of reproductive healthcare, or like you say, any healthcare that they need without having needing their parent or guardian to be involved where that isn't possible. And that's I think something that should concern every person in this country.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Is this a situation where, I mean, could be not the case, and we have to cut this, it's totally irrelevant, but can people directly support the legal effort that Pathe is undertaking? Is that possible?
Yeah, there's a donation page on Patha's website, just Patha, PATHA.NZ. But there's a parallel fundraising effort going on at the moment for parents and young people who've been affected by this ban. So yeah, if it does come into effect, it seems like the most effective pathway for most people, or yeah, the most effective pathway for a lot of people is going to be accessing healthcare overseas, which is going to come with associated costs.
Mm.
So Rainbow Youth is hosting that fundraiser. You should be able to find it on their website, but it is
Yeah.
also on Give a Little. And then if, best case scenario, the ban doesn't come into effect, those funds will be used to do what we said to improve access to this care, because even
Mm.
before the ban came into effect, the status quo wasn't good. Like we're talking about long wait lists, we're talking about huge areas of the country with no access to care whatsoever. We're talking about families who are struggling already, having to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket for appointments and for the medication itself. So anything raised that isn't needed to go around the ban will instead be used to improve access in general. So people have the financial means. I know it's a tough time of year, and it's a tough couple of years in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, that has a really significant positive impact for those who need access to that care too.
Yeah, if you're able to throw in something, you should throw in something. I will see whether or not we can get those added to our episode description. So just send those through to me, and we'll
Yeah,
have
will
those
do.
put up. But I think that's quite important as well. That you know, like you said, you had you had a legal team, sort of ready to go in anticipation of the fact that we know that these attacks were coming down the pipeline, and there will be more, right? Um, However, that's something which is, you know, the high court proceedings are unbelievably costly. People don't understand. We have streamlined them a little bit with the new rules that have just come in, but by God, like, if you want to access justice in this country, speaking of access, it's not great for anybody who doesn't have, a professional body behind them, right? So this is a situation in which I'm sure every little bit helps, and of course in your community, if you want to get involved in Rainbow Youth or anything akin to that, if you're in the community, in the queer community, and you want to, you know, see what you can do. There are people you can reach out to and ask them what kind of help that they need. And this is, an injury to one is an injury to all, right? And we need to think about it that way, that there is this kind of inseparable fabric from my perspective, that just as, the use of this is basically the same between transgender children and cisgender children, that although this is an attack on trans people, the reason why this is happening in the UK and the United States, and of course in New Zealand, is this coordinated international fascist attack on rights, on the out group, which can be hated so that they can implement authoritarian measures. And you start with vulnerable people, and, a small group of children is a pretty good way to start doing that, right? So we need to be quite wary of what the actual overall project of this is. From my perspective, again, I don't, I'm not co-signing everything from the guest. But it was really wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for giving your time. If there's anything else that you wanted to let the good folks at home know.
Oh, good question.
Shouts out to mum or something.
Yeah, shout out to my deaf mother who can't listen to podcasts. Yeah, I think I've said it all, to be honest. Go to
Yeah.
Pride this year,
Yeah.
we're coming into Pride season. Have a party, be in community, talk to the people around you. Shit's fucked, man. We got to take care of ourselves as much as we are putting into this work. And sometimes, taking action on this is how we take care of ourselves. But I think we do that better when we're surrounded by a community. So,
Yeah.
go to Pride. Remember where Pride started. Take that energy into
Yeah,
the season.
yeah. Absolutely. Do you want people to find you on any platforms or?
Yeah. You can find me. I write infrequently at jenniferkshields.nz, and you can find me on Blue Sky at jennafilm.nz. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That's been our 1 of 200 for today. Kyle says something about, take care, New Zealand. It's something like that anyway. I'm just going to say ka kite anō and a very good evening indeed.
If artifice is art, then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's apart now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day. This vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road to hell.